So, welcome to this session, and we have Heather Demarest.
All right, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, it's so nice after such a long time without feedback. So we'll see how this goes. Right. Okay, so I call this, psychological continuity in space-time. I think a lot about space-time, and I think a lot about personal identity. And it struck me there are some interesting questions here at this intersection. So I say, or persisting in spite of the relativistic odds. So I'm going to give kind of a probabilistic argument for why we should think we're persons. Okay, so here's how it's going to go. A little overview, personal identity and states at times. We're going to talk about special relativity and states at times. You can see the tension in the room increases. Those don't look great together. Rogue mental states, and then rogue persons. And I'm going to talk about something I'm going to call rest frame intelligibility. Okay, so personal identity, if it's been a while since you've thought about this is the question of what makes us the same person over time. So why it is that the baby is the same as the adult is the same as the old person. So this is a question of numerical identity. So we're not talking about qualitative similarity, but literally what makes you one and the same person. And of course, this will be more familiar. There are enduring and perduring accounts, right? So some people think that you're the same person because, you wholly exist at different times. Other people think you perdure because you have parts at different times. And of course, there are a lot of other views as well. But here's a question for anybody who's interested in personal identity is, what is the relation that exists between these different stages, either the wholly existing person or the part of a perduring person that's essential for persistence, right? In virtue of what are you the same person? And these accounts take for granted that one object, the stage, is at one time, and then it takes for granted there's another stage at another time. And then the question is, what's the relation between those two stages? Okay, so what are some answers to this question? These may sound familiar. We've got the soul theory that says they're the same person if and only if they each stage has the same soul. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly mention these to kind of jog your memory what the personal identity question is about. Some people think you're the same person in case the two stages are parts of the same human animal. Olson's view, the memory theory, John Locke says that the second stage remembers being the first stage. Then there are a bunch of problems with that, so you patch it up in various ways. Maybe the second stage remembers being someone who remembers being, right? You need a chain of memories. Then you patch it up because memory might turn out to be circular if it's factive. So now you say, okay, well, it quasi remembers or quasi. Anyway, without having to go into all these epicycles, we can arrive at this kind of account of psychological continuity that essentially says, just look at the mental states of the stages. And then you can have whatever complicated theory you want about how those mental states are connected to one another, right? Maybe they need the right kind of causal connection. Maybe there needs to be a memory. Maybe character traits need to be preserved in various ways. But what we need is something like that. And then we'll throw in, an unbranching chain because fission seems to be bad for identity. Okay, so what are these temporal stages that are taken as the kind of fundamental parts of your theory of personal identity? Well, in order to have these relations of psychological continuity between the stages at different times, the stages have got to have mental states. It's pretty built right in. And now mental states at times are going to depend, plausibly, on brain states at times. What almost all of the accounts in the personal literature or the personal identity literature assume is that we can make good sense of this, right? That you take these stages, brain states at times, mental states at times, those are kind of the given, right? That's what you're taking as your building blocks. And then you ask this further question, how are those related to one another, to decide whether or not they're related by numerical identity. Okay. So thinking a little bit more about the brain states that are had at times, you can imagine, suppose some subject is shown a red circle and a blue square. And as it turns out, different parts of the brain process color from shape. And one theory of how, so you might wonder, why is it that I see the red square or the red circle and the blue square rather than a blue square? And one of the answers that we get from psychology is that, in neuroscience, is that what binds these contents together is the fact that the different bits of the brain that process these things oscillate synchronously. So the fact that the red processing part of your brain fires synchronously with the circle part of your brain is what explains why it is you see it as a red circle. And then slightly later, you'll have an oscillation of the blue with the square, which explains why you bind those contents together as a blue square. Okay, so there's some empirical support for this hypothesis, but I just wanted to mention this as one example. It's a way of kind of giving us a concrete case to think about in terms of mental states that could be had at times, where we have a mental state of the experience of a red circle that depends on the brain state. And the brain state is what it is because of the synchrony of the different activity, right? Okay. So, my very scientific image here, you can see this way of thinking about it. And again, the details I don't think matter as long as something along these lines are right. As long as what it is to be in a certain brain state at a time has to do with different regions of the brain being in those states at that time, that's all I need, right? But this, just to make it concrete, we can look at it this way. So think of, R fibers corresponding to red, S fibers corresponding to square, R fibers, red, C fibers, circle. Right? So these brains would be like giving rise to different mental experiences in virtue of the fact that the red is firing with different things. Okay. So now we get the trouble. So special relativity says, there's no such thing as absolute simultaneity, that is a conventional fact, a way of carving up space-time. And so in order to characterize a spatially extended state at a time, right, or to characterize synchronous oscillations, right, what it means to be firing at the same time, we're going to have to choose a foliation or a slicing. So, and I'm only going to talk about special relativity here, so you can, frame of reference works too. So you might wonder, well, is P firing at the same time as Q2? Well, in frame 2 it is. What about Q1 and P? Well, those are firing synchronously in frame 1. And P and Q3 are happening simultaneously in frame 3. So this should feel pretty familiar. The relativity of simultaneity, but now we're thinking about how that is going to have implications for physical objects, namely your brain. So if there's no such thing as absolute simultaneity, then in order to characterize a spatially extended state at a time, or to characterize which things are firing synchronously, we're going to have to pick a foliation. And if we pick, the way I've drawn it here, if we pick different foliations, you can see how, according to foliation 1, you would be experiencing a red circle, but according to foliation 2, you would be experiencing a red square. Okay, so I call these rogue mental states. And there's a nice paper by Jeff Lee that discusses this in some more detail if you want to see the argument fleshed out more fully for why these could arise and all the different problems they have for different theories of mind. But essentially, the thought is that even if you yourself feel like you're experiencing the red circle and no red square, there very well may be a rogue mental state overlapping, right? The brain state of the red square would be overlapping with the brain state of a red circle. And there might be an experience of a red square, not had by you, just by your brain, right? From a different foliation. Okay, so you can see why these are called rogue mental states. They're not the ordinary ones that you would think of as happening in your own frame. Okay. So some empirical considerations. People are probably like, this sounds really implausible. One way you might cash this out is to, so empirically, like sci-fi empirically considerations here. You could imagine aliens traveling at very high speeds relative to one another, taking kind of MRI snapshots of your brain. Different observers will disagree about what's happening simultaneously. And therefore, you know, the MRI taken on Earth in your frame of reference might report back that you are experiencing a red circle, but one traveling very fast relative to you might take that snapshot and judge that different events in your brain were happening simultaneously. Therefore, the experience that was being had was actually that of a red circle. Square, whichever one you're not having. Okay, so another kind of empirical consideration that we should think about is that, you know, given the brain's size, do some calculations, the speed of light is incredibly fast. So if firings happen shorter than about 1.87 nanoseconds, you won't be able to get this frame dependence of different mental states, right? So it has to be that, you know, what counts as firing on the square and circle parts of your brain happen within that amount of time, like billionth of a second. So you might think that's empirically false, right? Maybe our brains are just slower than that. And if that's true, then it may be that while this isn't an actual problem for us, it could still be kind of a hypothetical problem. So maybe relativity will give us limits for like how big computer consciousness could be, or you think, oh, I want to grow my brain bigger so I can be smarter. And this says, well, not too fast, or you can end up with a bunch of rogue mental states. Or it may well be that as you build brains bigger, necessarily they go slower, and mental states get farther and farther apart in time. That would be like really interesting. So if you think it may not apply actually, we just can think about potential future creatures. Okay. Oh, see. Okay. So what do we need for the argument to work? You might be wanting to resist this. You think that's really implausible. I don't want rogue mental states. Jeff Lee's paper spends a lot of time trying to figure out ways to get out of this. You don't actually need that many assumptions, right? So you need that brain states are spatially extended. That's crucial. And temporally unextended. So again, the hypothesis is suppose there are mental states at times that depend on brain states at times. The other thing you need to assume is that brain states are foliation dependent, which seems to follow pretty straightforwardly from a relativity. Now, mental states depend on brain states. That's another assumption here. And mental states, you conclude, are foliation dependent. So there's a lot, you know, it's not like a logically sound or valid argument the way I've put it here. You need more premises to make it tight enough, but you see the structure of the argument. Okay. Now, suppose you want to avoid the relativity of mental states. Here are some different options, right? You could pick your poison. So perhaps relativity is wrong, right? Like a lot of people like to speculate about that. If that's true, then, you know, this whole argument goes out the window. Perhaps mental states depend on spatially unextended regions. So Chisholm, you know, is everyone's favorite example of somebody who defends point like there's a particle, a literal particle in your brain that's you that has all your mental states. If you believe something like that, again, this won't get off the ground because it needs to be spatially extended to have a difference in what counts as a brain state. Now, the most popular reaction that I've heard to this is like, extend in time the brain state, right? So you say, actually, mental states supervene on larger chunks. So that may be, of course, there's a whole host of problems, as people who are philosophers of time will know, like intimately, like, oh, it's thicker. What does that look like? You know, you have some kind of specious experience, like how thick is it? What do the corners look like? You have all kinds of issues about like where exactly the brain state begins and ends, and what do you do about overlapping regions, things like that. But you know, that would be one way to go, right, is to fix all that up. Another thing, and this is Lee's preferred solution, which I honestly just don't understand very well. So I'm not going to discuss it, but he thinks that you can distinguish like this momentary frame-dependent mental property from the overall like temporally extended mental phenomenology, so that you might be having the same experiences, even though it kind of is built out of different momentary pieces. Okay, so I am mostly just not going to consider those because I don't have enough time, but also because I'm interested in the question of like, what should we think if we think mental states are had at times, right? If we really do think that there's this idea that mental states are thin, and we like relativity. Okay, so you might think that one of the problems with everything that's come before, and this is a very popular idea, defended by very important people, that like the deep lesson we get from relativity is that space-time is fundamental, right? So like all this slicing, it's conventional, it's silly, it's unimportant, it's not reflecting deep structure. So we have some nice quotes here from Gibson and Pooley, where they're describing how four-dimensional objects can have temporal parts, sure, but they're going to be arbitrary, right? So we get a nice definition of it being a maximal slice of a four-dimensional object, and then you see that. So I'm just going to read this. You know, temporal parts are arbitrary and can't sustain any metaphysically heavy-duty weight. That's me. That's me characterizing. And then the quote here is, you know, from a relativistic point of view, the assumption that a perduring object has parts at every proper subregion of its world tube is overwhelmingly natural. Call this the doctrine of arbitrary spatio-temporal parts. From a relativistic point of view, it should be a starting point. The existence of specifically temporal parts of an object does not even warrant comment. It should be clear that relativity's unification of space and time leaves no distinctive work for the notion of a temporal part to do in explaining persistence. So this is a very kind of plausible view if you think that there's just space-time and different ways of slicing it that are arbitrary or conventional. So what I want to point out is that this is in tension with the ideas we get from personal identity literature, where actually the temporal parts are crucial. They're the building blocks of what it is to be a person over time. So the theories of personal identity do not take the temporal stages to be conventional. It's really crucial that they are not conventional because they're the building blocks. So almost every theory of personal identity you'll find has something like this, right? S1 at T1 is numerically the same person as S2 at T2, if and only if. And then the whole debate is about like what's on the right-hand side, not at all about the left-hand side. So T1 and T2 are times, and those are thin. So this is at least a prima facie tension. So you might think if space-time and four-dimensional objects are fundamental, then the questions of persistence really have to be settled before you can consider arbitrary person stages, right? So you first have to know what the worm is in order to know what count as arbitrary slices of it. But that, of course, would beg the question against all these theories of personal identity, which claim it's the other way around. Okay, so a pithy way to put this is, do stages depend on persons or do persons depend on stages? Okay, so I think the resolution is not that far, you know, it's fairly easy to find. you basically just posit a plethora of 4-dimensional objects. It's cheap, be promiscuous about it. They're everywhere. But the only ones of those that count as persons are the ones that have stages that are related in the right kind of way. And if you're somebody who thinks there aren't so many objects, then they could be object candidates or something. And even if you do this, though, the temporal stages of persons are not going to be arbitrary. It's not the case that any way of slicing things are going to lead to the same conclusions about which of those count as persons. Only some ways of slicing these 4-dimensional objects will yield like intelligible mental states that are related by psychological continuity. Some ways, let's see if I say this. Yeah, so think of, the very simple case of experiencing a red circle. If you have that experience, but there's a rogue mental state that's having the experience of a red square, but then later there's only a stage that remembers experiencing a red circle. It's hard to keep straight. Then that will count as a person, right? Those slicings will count as slices of a person. They'll count as stages of a person in virtue of like the memory theory. But the one that experienced the red square, if there's nothing else that's unified in that way of slicing up the 4-dimensional worm, will not count as a person. Those stages will not be stages, right, that are each themselves containing mental states that can be properly related. Okay, but you might think, get a little creative and you say, well, what if there's a rogue mental state of remembering now, right? And the rogue mental state remembers seeing a red square, and that's caused in all the right kinds of ways, just like the rogue, or just like the, let's say, default mental state of remembering seeing the red circle is related in the right way to the experience of the red circle. So then it seems like you could end up with a rogue person, right? So this is a person that would be totally, right, contained within your own space-time worm, but who would have different experiences. Okay. So how likely is this? I now get into the probabilities. So it seems to me there are infinitely many different foliations that would go through your brain, right? If space is continuous, how that goes. So there are a couple of questions. One is, should we think that there are infinitely many rogue mental states, right? One corresponding to each foliation. One thing to note is, oh yeah, and then like how likely should we think that the rogue persons are? So first question, one thing to notice about these infinitely many mental states is that almost all of them are going to be duplicates. So like there are like going to be infinitely many brain states that are red circles because they're just that close together. And so you can think of, in a trillionth of a second later, you're still going to have all the same firings on both sides of the brain. So those will all count. Now, you might worry, is this overcounting, right? I don't maybe have that many experiences of the red circle. And there's, I think, a kind of interesting analogy here with your atoms, right? There was for a while in the mereology literature a question of like, how many people are there here? Because there's me, but there's also like me minus an atom and me minus like that atom. And it seems like that's overcounting. So there are kind of like maximality considerations you could bring in. So there might be like similar moves here that you could make to rule out the duplicates, maybe vagueness or coarse graining or some kind of maximality. I'm not sure. I haven't thought about that yet. But even so, the question that I think is more interesting is what about the ones that aren't duplicates, right? What about the ones that are red squares instead of red circles? So even if there are infinitely many rogue mental states, I don't think it's likely that there are going to be many rogue persons. And that is because persons, right, have this psychological continuity. They have this kind of coherence or intelligibility. So when there is a red circle, people have an experience of a red circle, and then they behave in ways that are responsive to there being a red circle. So they're disposed to say things like, I see a red circle. rogue mental states are just not very likely to be part of this kind of intelligible sequence, right? So even if there's an experience of a red square happening, supervening in some way on the brain in a different frame, it's unlikely, right, that there will ever be a verbal report of a red square. And then it's unlikely, right, that that would follow on to there being a red square in a visual field. Okay, good. So this gives us a kind of probabilistic argument, right? That even if you think rogue mental states are incredibly common, they will not comprise rogue persons in general. Okay, so I want to end by arguing that a lot of people are very dismissive of rest frames being special, and like Jeff Lee, for instance, has this view. But I think that this is actually going to resolve a lot of the problems because, you know, the right mental states, or the ones that compose persons, are going to be the ones that are had in the rest frame. And one way to see that is that a brain, right, can be reoriented in space, which will change the foliations that are having those, the brain states, right, that are having the red square might be this foliation. And as I turn, right, it will not be the case anymore because, right, it's like the left-right thing. I don't know, that didn't make any sense when I just said it, but the idea is it's on the rest frame foliation is the one that's like flat, right? So as I do this or like look upside down, that rest frame foliation will continue to represent a red circle, right? Whereas the other frames will not. They will radically change which mental state I'm represented as having. Additionally, the brain represents the world according to the rest frame that it's in, right? So when you see a red circle, you don't see it as red shifted or blue shifted, right? Because it's in your rest frame. And I think there are probably lots of really good evolutionary things that Craig has probably said about all this, how this all works nicely. And so essentially, I think this gives us a nice reason to say that we are rest frame creatures, right? So our brains have their natural mental states in the rest frame, and those represent the content as it is in our rest frame, and that gives us rest frame persons that can have the kind of coherence and intelligibility that is not had by the rogue mental states. So there are a couple of like interesting consequences to this. If there is a preferred, so there's some presentists who like the idea of there being like a preferred presentist frame. And maybe something that's gone unnoticed is that if you're moving very fast relative to that frame, people say like, you couldn't tell that you're not, there's no way to like detect the preferred frame. But of course, if you in fact are in the preferred frame, or if in fact there's a preferred frame and you're moving very fast relative to it, then all of your mental states will be the rogue ones, right? The ones that are intelligible from your own rest frame won't exist, right? They won't be real because the only ones that are real are in the preferred frame. So that means that anybody who is moving with a fast speed relative to the presentist preferred frame would be unintelligible. There would not be persons, right, doing that. I think fragmentalist accounts, right? So like different kinds of presentism, but like if you had a fragmentalist account, I think that could avoid this precisely because they appreciate, you know, the relativistic features. Okay, yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, so I definitely never, well, it never occurred to me that this was a problem. That was really cool. Thank you. All right, so let's take your hypothetical scenario and let's make it a spatially very large brain also. So let's run with this as much as we can. Okay. So now the alien's zipping by, taking instantaneous snapshots of the state of your brain, right? As moving relative to you. Okay. So wouldn't there'd be a couple things that they would notice though, that the sequence wouldn't make sense, right? So that would be another thing.
Yeah.
And also there would be they'd also be looking at correspondence, like they're talking about perception, like they're looking at correspondence with what's around you. So that also would be off.
Yeah, that's right. So the aliens could, for instance, tell that what they thought of as your mental state at a time must not be right because it wouldn't explain any of your actions, right? So they could maybe do this inference and say, oh, then I bet it's this other state that's the important one.
Yeah, but I mean, but I recognize at the same time, like why does it have to make sense and why does it have to correspond, right? So yeah, I don't see the answer to, no, it's not a criticism. I'm also puzzled by the problem. That's all. I'm just appreciating the problem. That's all.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. So I wonder if this is more of an issue for a pejorantist than for an endurantist.
Sure.
My reasoning being for the pejorantist, it seems like the slices really matter, but the endurantist, I'm not at all sure that that's true. I'm tempted to say they're gonna, the slices are just as arbitrary as the fundamentalist about space-time wants to say that they are.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I'm not sure. So it depends a ton on what kind of endurantist you're going to be. But I think if you're an endurantist who thinks that people are wholly present at times, all of this will still go through.
Because of the presentness. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
or just because it being a
yeah.
time, right? A thin,
Okay.
So if you're an endurantist with like some bulk, some heft.
And so are you tempted to
temporally.
say, let's ditch these accounts of personal identity over time? I don't know, maybe go for parfit survivalist or something?
Yeah, so that would be another interesting move. I think Parfit, though, still wants psychological connectedness. So he's still going to want there to be kind of meaningful connections between mental states, even if it's not strict identity. Yeah, so maybe I shouldn't have emphasized so much the numerical part. If we think they're intelligibly related mental states, yeah, should go through.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So from the physics point of view, the problem that you're talking about is a problem of describing non-local objects in special relativity.
Yeah, space like, yeah.
The standard answer is that there isn't any such thing. That if you have part of your brain recognizing red in one area and a part recognizing a circle in a different area, it's only when that information is combined that it becomes a mental state that recognizes a red circle. And for that to be combined, signals have to come from both of those areas and meet somewhere. And once you have that, what matters is the place that they meet, and that's relativistically invariant.
Good. Yeah. So here I feel very sad that I don't know more about philosophy of mind, because I feel like I run up immediately against the kind of like hard problem of what even is a mental state and how even does it depend on a brain. So part of my project is to just say, I'm going to just have mental states at times depend on brain states at times. Now, you could resist that in a bunch of different ways. And one of the ways is to do the point thing and say, and I certainly have this intuition, like, to put it uncharitably to myself, I have this intuition that like eventually all the signals have to end up at the homunculus, who then decides what they're experiencing. But of course, we don't think there is anything like that. So the question is it now that mental states supervene on points of like light interaction or signal interaction of the brain, when the signals do meet, and where do they meet? And like, that's just me, my ignorance of, neuro.
They certainly don't all have to meet at the same point.
Sure.
But the combined state of red and circle the information of red and the information of circle have to meet somewhere to be red circle.
Yeah, so that would still be, I think you'd still have to endorse something like the view that ultimately mental states supervene on points, right? Maybe the point of interaction. And so I think that, you know, all the literature I'm familiar with from neuroscience is actually consciousness is distributed. It's a highly distributed thing in the brain. And I share the very same intuition. So I get, this is just me not knowing the right thing to say here, but yeah, it really feels like relativity has shown us there can't be, like, I'm not a quantum entangled system, we don't think. I mean, maybe we do, I don't know. That's not what this relies on, right? It's supposed to just be mental states on brain states. But if it turns out the relevant brain state is a point, that would be another way to get around this.
Thanks. That was really a lot of fun. I was just going to say exactly the same thing, more or less, as Steve just said. So that, well, first of all, I was going to say, if we know anything, I think from cognitive science, it's that, you know, experiences take time. So somehow we should be traveling down that path of that, you know, it's a temporally extended process. But then, you know, in psychology, synchrony is it's between two events which are time-like related, not space-like related. You know, so if I think of, you know, these two snappings, they're synchronous. They're almost surely time-like related to each other. And then, as Steve said, there's going to be some third event that decides whether, you know, those things are synchronous or not. And so then that's all time-like related as well. But even these things are time-like related to each other. And so then I don't get all the kind of frame carving, you know, that it doesn't become, maybe, I mean, maybe it doesn't solve the problem. Maybe there is some, maybe the decider is extended but still it's all, I think it's all time-like.
Yeah, so I think it's just empirical, right? So if the brain is big enough, synchrony, of course, means happening at the same time. So if the argument is just, it just so happens our brains are small enough, you know, they happen to be time-like related, then you're right, you don't get this. And that was the bit about the 1.87 nanoseconds.
Must be a flight so fast from one side of the brain to the other. I mean,
yeah, I know. Well, I know I have light signals bouncing around as fast as possible. But yeah, I think the more genuine thing to say is there's a lot I don't know about neuroscience, and so I'm happy to be corrected on this. If, however, your theory of personal identity requires a mental state at a time because it's a stage, and if there's something about a brain state at a time that gives rise to the mental state, then that will be frame dependent. So you'd have to reject one of those. And maybe the way to do it is to reject that it's a brain state at a time, or to say that the brain state at a time is this kind of homunculus point where the signals eventually interact. But I think, you know, those are your options to, yeah, get around this.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. That was really quite interesting. In your assumptions, in your initial assumptions, you mentioned that mental states depend on brain states.
Yeah.
Now, I'm just curious, does this entail that brain states are sufficient to have mental states?
Gosh, I don't know.
Because,
I mean, yeah.
No, because what I want to say, because to me, it sounds like unless you think so, unless you think that you believe in a fully physicalist account of the mind, then the entire problem of the relativity of mental states doesn't appear in the first place, because then you will have a non-physicalist element that might already determine the preferred foliation. So we don't have the problem of rogue mental states or rogue persons. So,
yeah, good.
Yeah.
So great. Yeah, so you can always go non-physicalist and say there's a soul or something, or whatever, mental properties that are not reducible or dependent. So yeah, I was assuming physicalism. I should have thrown that in there as well. But I think what one point you raise is it could then be, you could somehow, the soul could know about the preferred foliation or something. And one thing that would be interesting is if you saw like the states that correspond, like if we got to, suppose there's really fast aliens that zoom by and we notice that all of their brain states look horribly jumbled according to our fMRI machine, but like to theirs are like, or like look horribly jumbled according to what we would think of as their own rest frame, but look like perfectly make sense according to our rest frame, then we might say, oh, their mental states are only intelligible relative to like this rest frame. I guess we are in the preferred frame. So there's always like possibility for like kind of, I don't know. Your question reminded me of this additional thing I wanted to say.
So I just had the same reaction as Steve and Craig, more or less, but then I started thinking if an observer was going fast enough for this to kind of be an issue that they might misinterpret or see different brain states, they're going to be going so fast, and you have to take into account the time dilation effect also. Basically, any motion of the neurons in the brain that was sort of in the direction of motion, relative motion, would be frozen. And then I'm wondering whether you could even talk about the same type of physical processes happening in that kind of brain.
Yeah, I mean, so, this is very sci-fi. The picture is going to have to use futuristic technology. That's really good. But I think, the main argument is just that when they back solve to figure out what things they would take to have happened synchronously, they'll get a different answer than we would give. And that's really all we need.
Yeah, even if there are no rogue people, I'm pretty uneasy about all these rogue brain states. And I was wondering if you could get away with them by saying that, well, you think arrest frames are special. So why don't you say, no, they're really special. They are the only frames where consciousness arises, or which determine consciousness. So the only brain states that exist are those that are determined by the rest frame. And that seems pretty clean, not ad hoc. So why don't you just say that and get out of it?
Yeah, so if it turns out that, each creature's rest frame is the real one, right? You're some kind of crazy solipsis presentist or whatever, then that might be exactly the result you'd get. There would be no rogue mental states. Yeah, beautiful.
So I had the same reaction as a large chunk of people in this room. But I was wondering about whether there's some way to solve this, or something like, so instead of worrying about like, where it meets and that points where consciousness is, you could say something along the lines of like, sure, like I'm instantiating like red here and square here in my brain, but there's only, no matter what foliation you have, those two signals are only going to meet in any frame, right? Like only the red and the square are going to be the ones that meet. And so if later on I'm instantiating circle, like those signals are just never going to like connect in the right ways, because by the time circle makes its way across, red's turned off or something, right? Like, and so it seems like you might be able to argue that like, no matter what frame you're in, red and circle are the only two signals that connect in the right kind of way, and that's going to be frame independent.
Yeah, I mean, so here I think what you guys are all pushing for is basically a more careful neurological account of what it is to have a brain state that underlies a conscious state. And it would be, if that's all that we learn from this relativistic argument, I would be super excited about that, right? Because then you say, look, it can't just be a brain state at a time, like everybody loves to parrot in all of these different literatures. Rather, it's this much more complicated, maybe more interesting, more nuanced picture of careful, interactions that are happening in different parts of the brain at different times. And that's what underlies consciousness. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that we are now out of time, so we should thank the speaker again. Thank you.
Thank you.